Hey guys, welcome back to Embers and Ash. My name's Ashley. If you didn't know, I'm bringing you another episode of Motherhood in Progress, and today we're talking about how many children you should have. I'm really excited about this one. I myself feel a lot of conflict over this question, so I did a bunch of research, asked you guys a lot of questions, and I have a lot to share. As per usual, I want to state that Motherhood in Progress is a series all about talking about issues in motherhood, parenthood that don't really have answers, but I think there's a lot that you can get from just having a conversation. This is supposed to be two-sided, so I want to hear your opinions and your mindset on things in the comments. Okay, that's all I have to say, right? I think I'm getting quicker at it. So, how many children should you have? This is, like I said, something I've been really pondering over because it's so life-defining and it's a lot of pressure. I, before having a kid, thought for sure that I wanted like 4 kids, maybe 3, but I was really leaning towards 4. And now that I have 1, I'm like reconsidering everything. I love motherhood. I love having my 1 son, but 4 seems like insane, like way more than I can handle. I don't want to feel like motherhood is everything in my life, which I know a lot of people love that, but I want to have things outside of motherhood, and I feel like if I have 4 kids, I won't be able to have that. But I don't know, because I don't have 4 kids. So here we are, trying to figure it out. I also went into this looking for just someone to tell me how many kids to have, because if there was a legitimate reason to have a certain amount, then I'm cool with just like running with that. I don't want to have to make the decision. I also get really frustrated because whenever I ask someone about it, they often say, well, you'll just know when you want to have another child, or you'll just know when you're done having children. And like, it's not that that's not real, like I'm sure it is, but it's not good enough for me right now because I'm feeling the pressure of Rook is over a year old, so I should be like thinking about a second, but I don't want to be. So here we are looking into it. As per usual, we're going to start off with the community, what you guys had to say about how many children you should have. So first of all, I asked, how many children do you want to have, or like what's your ideal? And majority of you said 2. Second runner-up was 3, which is not surprising. I think that's like the standard in North America these days, is to have 2 or 3 children. I also wanted to ask if having more children after 1 made you happier, because I was curious if it was having a child in general that makes you happy, or if your happiness does grow with more children. And 60% of you said that you were happier with more. So I thought that was interesting that it wasn't an overwhelming amount, and that maybe some people are less happy or struggling more with more kids. I also wanted to know what limiting factors there were for you choosing or not being able to choose how many kids you were having. And they included your size of car, size of house, fertility limits was a big one, when it feels right, being outnumbered was a big factor, and also your mental health. So those are all obviously kind of personal reasons why to limit your children, but there also are a lot of external reasons which I want to get into. I'm going to touch on the external reasons first, and then we'll move on to exploring some of these personal reasons that you shared. Okay, so the first determining factor for how many children you should have is climate change. Climate change is huge, it's real, we're living in it right now, and there's been a lot of articles coming out saying that having less children is the best thing you can do for the environment. So there was a lot to explore here. So this one article states, the greatest impact individuals can have in fighting climate change is to have 1 fewer child, according to a new study that identifies the most effective way people can cut their carbon emissions. And then they show this graphic displaying the huge impact having 1 less child can have on our environment, or the CO2 emissions in particular. Very convincing, very scary, but there's been a lot of critique over these statements because it's only looking at like one part of the story, because it's really only developed countries that are having this massive impact on the environment, whereas the developing countries, they can have more kids and it doesn't really make a difference. The top 10% of world population are responsible for 34% of household-related direct and indirect carbon emissions. So really we should be looking at this top 10% of population. If we look at CO2 emissions per capita, so based on population, it's really just the developed countries that are making this huge impact. So specifically, the US and Canada are ranking top in the CO2 emissions, which is so tragic. Like, I thought in Canada we were doing better, maybe because of the propaganda we're getting, but it's very concerning. Very concerning. Also though, I want to clarify that this is, like I said, based on the population, not as a whole. The graph changes drastically when you look at which countries are just producing the most CO2. Very different. So then if you go to the bottom of the list, which this is a condensed one, but we can see that those developing countries have such a low impact on CO2 emissions. So this shows that it doesn't really matter your population or how many children people are having, but what you're doing as a society for the environment. Not to say that the goal is to be like these developing countries, because like I said earlier, if you look at the graph of total CO2 emissions, some of these developing countries have a horrible footprint, but we've also seen developed countries making changes and reducing their CO2 footprint even though their population has gone up. Switzerland commits to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 compared to the 1990 levels, corresponding to an average reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 35% over the period 2021 to 2030. By 2025, a reduction in greenhouse gases by 35% compared to the 1990 levels is anticipated. And you can see the effect of this. Switzerland is ranking 67th based on CO2 emissions per capita. So if we change the way that we're living our lives in these developed countries, change our policies in government, then we don't need to be limiting the amount of children per family because we've solved this issue already. The other issue with this idea of having one less child is that you would have to wait like hundreds of years to see the impact of a lower population. But the climate crisis is right now, and we can't wait that long to make these changes. So if we can make the changes now to the environment, how we're living our lives, then we reduce our CO2 footprint, and it doesn't matter how big the population is based on climate change. So that was very interesting. Okay, but that's not the end of the story of our population's effect on the Earth. The other main issue is overpopulation and carrying capacity. So questions like, how are we supposed to feed everyone? How are we supposed to house everyone? There is a limit to what the Earth can handle. It is the maximum population size an environment can sustain indefinitely. The range of estimates is enormous, fluctuating from 500 million people to more than 1 trillion. The scientists disagree not only on the final number, but more importantly about the best and most accurate way of determining that number, hence the huge variability. So the number isn't exact, but a lot of scientists are agreeing that it is around 10 billion. And as you can expect, we are stretching our carrying capacity, and it's expected that we will reach it in the next 100 years. But again, it's important to note that not all countries are having the same effect on the carrying capacity. There's this very fun chart here that shows the number of Earths needed if the world's population lived like the following countries. So if everyone lived like the people in the US, we would need 5 Earths to have enough resources to sustain our population. Moving down, it's not on this chart, but if everyone lived like people in India lived, we wouldn't even need a whole Earth to sustain our population. So that's pretty dim and grim, knowing that if everyone lived, and Canada's not on this list, but I'm sure we're right beside the US, knowing that if everyone lived the way I lived, we wouldn't be able to sustain ourselves. Like, what do I need to do to fix this? That's what I'm thinking. Do I need to have less children? Is that the answer? Like, what do I need to do to solve this problem? But like I said earlier, the carrying capacity number isn't exact because there's so many variables, one of them being technology and the way we produce food, surprisingly, has changed a lot over the years to adjust for more people, as well as lifestyle. There's a lot of different lifestyles that have a lesser effect on the environment, such as becoming vegetarian. If everyone agreed to become vegetarian, leaving little or nothing for livestock, the present 1.4 billion hectares of arable land would support about 10 billion people. The 3.5 billion hectares would produce approximately 2 billion tons of grains annually, he explained. That's enough to feed 10 billion vegetarians, but would only only feed 2.5 billion US omnivores because so much vegetation is dedicated to livestock and poultry in the United States. Very interesting. I'm not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarian. I try and limit my meat intake. I'm not trying to toot my own horn, I'm just letting you know how it is. But that's so compelling to make me want to become vegetarian because of the impact on the environment, which I already knew that, you know, there was an impact, but getting to see concrete numbers like that is really interesting. But even if we're able to make these changes and sustain life on Earth, it brings up the question of what our quality of life would be like. It makes me think of, you know, those like post-apocalyptic worlds where everyone's alive, but they're living a horrible life, like on food scraps and that kind of thing. I don't know. Well, as it turns out, we don't really have to worry about this as much as it seems because our repopulation rate on Earth is actually on the decline. There was a thorough study on the matter that says, combining the scenarios for mortality, fertility, and migration, we forecasted global population in the reference scenario to peak at 9.73 billion people in 2064 and then decline to 8.7 billion by 2100. Super interesting. I had no idea that our population was going down and that we're actually going to reach a peak and then decrease in population. Why hasn't anyone told me this? So to explain this further, fertility fell dramatically in many countries over the past 70 years, but that the global population is still rising. On average, women in 1950 were having 4.7 children in their lifetime on average, and by 2017, that had halved to 2.4 children per woman. During the same period, the global population nearly tripled from 2.6 billion to 7.7 billion, and that means their birth rates have fallen below the levels needed to sustain their population size. And from this graph here, we can see that a lot of the decrease in birth rates is happening in developed countries. So that raises the question, why are birth rates decreasing in developed countries and increasing in developing countries? Let's start with developing countries. There's this one article that says, first, poor nations are usually agricultural ones. In agricultural societies, children are an important economic resource as a family will be more productive if it has more children. This means that families will ordinarily try to have as many children as possible. Second, infant and child mortality rates are high in these nations. Because parents realize that one or more of their children may die before adulthood, they have more children to make up for the anticipated deaths. A third reason is that many parents of low-income nations prefer sons over daughters, and if a daughter is born, they try again for a son. Fourth, traditional gender roles are often very strong in poor nations, and these roles include the belief that women should be wives and mothers above all. Finally, contraception is uncommon in poor nations. Without contraception, many more pregnancies and births certainly occur. For these reasons, then, fertility is much higher in poor nations than in rich nations. So then moving to the developed countries, why are our birth rates going down so much? Well, for one, children in these rich countries, developed countries, are a financial burden as opposed to a financial asset. We're not sending them out to the fields to farm. We're paying for feeding them, education, daycare, all these things. People are also starting to have families later in life. This is very common nowadays for women to have their first child in their 30s, which is all fine and dandy, but that tends to mean that there's a limit on how many children you can have because your fertility starts to decrease at the age of 30. Another huge thing, especially in cities like mine, which are so expensive, there's a limit to how many kids you can have in a house, and a lot of people are stuck to having smaller homes, so they choose to have less children. I've seen this a lot in my life. People who are in 2-bedroom apartments are only having 2 children. And apparently we're still seeing a lot of side effects from the Great Recession in 2008, creating financial instability, and when people aren't financially stable, they have less kids. So, based on this, overpopulation isn't really an issue. Like, we're likely to peak at that 10 billion mark, and that probably won't be great, but we're very unlikely to surpass it, and we're gonna settle back down to a number that is comfortable if we're staying on trend. But that might still be more incentive for you to have less kids so that our population doesn't get as high and we can help kind of decrease it. But there are some worrisome side effects that people are talking about, and more reason to have more kids despite the overpopulation issue. Holy, this is gonna be a long video. Okay, let's talk about the economy. The number of children we have has a direct relationship with the economy. When we have an increasing population, we have more jobs being created, more money being spent, whereas if the population decreases, the economy suffers. Specifically in the US, we can see from this graph that our fertility rates have, well, not our, I live in Canada, but these fertility rates have decreased substantially over the past 200 years, since 1800 it says. And the problem with this is that it's actually dropped below the rate of replacement. The rate of replacement is how many people we need to be born to replace the current amount of population. So we're having less kids than it would take to maintain the population of the US and other countries. And that rate is 2.1 children per woman. The reason it's 2.1 is to replace herself, replace the man that gave her that child. And the 0.1, I think, is to take into account child deaths. A steady decrease in population is fine. The economy can adjust. But something drastic like this is a huge concern because there's a lot of implications here. These issues include not being able to fund the retired, not having enough people joining the work, so a lot of companies struggling to find workers, and just less commerce in general, so less money coming in and going out. Because people in many industrial nations are living longer while birth rates drop, these nations are increasingly having a greater proportion of older people and smaller proportion of younger people. In several European nations, there are more people 61 or older than 19 or younger. As this trend continues, it will become increasingly difficult to take care of the health and income needs of so many older persons. And there may be too few younger people to fill many jobs and provide the many services that an industrial society demands. The smaller labor force may also mean that the government will have fewer income tax dollars to provide these services. So it's not great. And because of this, several countries are actually implementing policies to encourage women to have children. Something else that has been blowing my mind. Like, especially coming out of this conversation on overpopulation, the effect on the economy is outweighing overpopulation in the minds of government, I guess. So, places like Russia. In some cases, they provide the equivalent of $9,000 for each child beyond the first. Can you imagine? Spain provides $3,400 for each child. And in Hungary, they proposed that families with 4 or more children will not pay income tax. I would have 4 children if it meant that I don't have to pay income tax. I mean, like, sorry, I'm very pro-tax, but if I just have to have more kids to not pay tax, I'm obviously gonna do it. But despite all this, there might be a simple solution, which is just immigration. Since developing countries still have that higher birth rate, wouldn't it make sense to just bring those people into developed countries that need a higher population? As long as they're willing, obviously. It's especially convenient when you don't have to wait for a baby to become 18. You can just bring in an 18-year-old from another country. Makes sense to me, but also there's the issue of these developing countries are developing and are hoping to become developed. So once they reach that point, it's probably likely that their population rate will go down, and then we don't have people to bring in, so we probably still need to have more children ourselves. I don't know. Okay, so those are the external factors to take into account, but most of the time we're thinking of our personal situations. I asked you guys a little poll of what reasons were limiting you, if it was your finances, overpopulation, or the environment that was like limiting how many kids you want to have, and the vast majority of you don't care about the environment. But I can definitely understand, like, I wanted to take this information into account when deciding how many kids to have, but at the end of the day, it's my personal situation that's going to determine how many kids I want. So, I want to talk about how many kids will make us the happiest. This is, as you can expect, a very complicated question with a very complicated answer, if you can even call it that, but let's talk about what's out there. So, in the United States, nearly half of adults consider 2 to be the ideal number of children, with 3 as the next popular option. Once again, I already mentioned I polled you guys on Instagram and I got the exact same results. Not surprising. One interesting note is that these numbers are most likely specific to our generation and not a blanket statement for forever onwards. The two-child ideal is a major departure from half a century ago. In 1957, only 20% of Americans said that the ideal family meant 2 or fewer children, while 71% said that it meant 3 or more. The economy seems to have played some role in this shift. The ideal during the baby boom was in the neighborhood of 3, 4, or 5 children. That number plummeted as the cost of rearing children rose and more women entered the workforce and felt a growing sense of frustration about being reduced to childbearing machines. But that still raises the question of how many children will make us happier. Well, apparently back in 2006, a study came out saying that adding a second or third child doesn't make you any happier. That's grim. But since then, another study came out saying that we find that happiness increases in the year around the birth of the first child and then decreases to before child levels. They suggest that having up to 2 children increases happiness, and although having the first 2 children increases happiness, having a third child does not. So apparently the studies are saying that 2 makes you the happiest and adding a third does not make you happier. But I feel like we can't just take that as it is. For one, who's to say that another study won't come around in the next couple of years saying, well, actually it's 3 children, right? But if we look back at what I was saying earlier, comparing to the 1940s and 50s, it really is our situation that determines how many kids make us happy. The optimal number of children is specific to each family's desires and constraints. When a couple feels that they have more interest in kids, more energy for kids, maybe more support like grandparents in the area, and a decent income, then having a large family can be the best option for them. That has made some connections for me just because, like I said, I look at the families with 4 children and I'm like, how do you do it? Like, how is that what makes you happy? But maybe they just have more financial support, more family support, that it just works well for them. And then on the other side of things, when a couple has fewer resources, either emotional, social, or financial, then having a smaller family is probably best for them. So we need to be looking more at our situation rather than the general ideal. I also want to touch on having 1 child because there is this movement of people wanting only 1 child. And what I read online was saying that we need to not only be looking at what's best for parents, but what's best for children, saying that it might not be in your child's best interest to have only 1. But I feel like that's a little skewed because there's plenty of parents who only have 1 child and they just readjust their parenting style accordingly. Like maybe they put them in more sports or whatever so that they get that social interaction that they're missing from siblings. Okay, so what does it all mean? I always end on what does it all mean? And I also always say, I don't know what it all means. It's very confusing. That's the point of this series. I'm more confused than ever. I was going into this really wanting like some concrete evidence of I should have 2 children. This is one of those issues where I really just want to be told what to do. But there's so many variables in place. It is encouraging to know that if I do choose to have multiple children, I won't feel the guilt of my effect on the environment necessarily, and maybe I'll feel more compelled to teach my children more about being environmentally conscious because you need to, because of the pressure of my children's carbon footprint. I also feel compelled to meet that 2.1 kids requirement so that we are meeting the current population levels. But on the other side of things, I still don't want us to reach 10 billion people, even if it is gonna go down. But I also don't want our economy to crash. So I don't know what to do. Sorry, we've been interrupted again. Rook has been teething lately, so his naps have not been ideal. Where was I? Oh, the one thing that was very helpful for me in this is that I really should be looking at my financial and social situation when deciding how many children I want, because it has been shown that the number of children only makes you happier if you're financially and socially stable. So I think I'll leave it at that. I hope this was helpful for you guys. I did learn a lot myself, so I hope you did as well. As per usual, please let me know in the comments your opinions, your mindsets, if I got anything wrong, if there's anything I missed, and any other suggestions for Motherhood in Progress, topics, ideas, that kind of thing. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.